Welcome into Purple Daily. Phil Mackey, Judd Zulgad, and producer Declan Goff here. And every week or so, we've been diving into these alternate realities where this started off on Mackey and Judd, the podcast, which you can also subscribe to on Apple, Spotify, and scorenorth.com, where we went through different Minnesota sports alternate realities. Like, what if Joe Mauer doesn't get hurt here, there, whatever? And then it's kind of spinned into Vikings alternate realities. And so let's make this official here.
So many significant sporting events in Minnesota's history. Some have made us ask the question, what if? Like, what if Stephon Marbury hadn't left the Wolves? What if Gary Anderson had made that kick?
Do you think Gary Anderson will make this field goal? The answer should probably be yes.
39 yards away. He is still perfect. Minnesota leads by 10.
What if there is no Minneapolis Miracle?
Dana steps into it. Pass is up for grabs and picked off by Marcus Williams.
Yes, it's time to ask what if in Mackey, Judd, and Rami's alternate reality.
Unbelievable! Vikings win the Super Bowl!
All right, so here it is. Here's today's alternate reality, courtesy of Judd Zulgad. I amended the one that you sent to be this instead because I think it takes it back a necessary step.
Okay.
What if Brett Favre just flat retires and does not come back for the 2010 season? What would have happened the next few years? How long would Brad Childress have coached? Would Christian Ponder have even been drafted? What becomes of the Vikings franchise? Does it train wreck as bad as it did in 2010 and 11 if Brett Favre just does not come back for that fateful 2010 season where he winds up basically unconscious on the frozen tundra of TCF Bank Stadium?
Still to this press conference. So my question was what if Childress doesn't get fired, right, in 2010? So if Brett Favre doesn't, so if they send, to backtrack, Steve Hutchinson, Ryan Longwell, and Jared Allen to Mississippi to talk Favre out of retirement, and instead of Favre saying, okay, I'll do it, he says, absolutely not. See, you guys get out of my house. In fact, I'm calling the cops.
In fact, I am a cop.
And then your quarterback for that season is what? Like
Probably T-Jax.
Tavares Jackson?
Actually, I've got some takes on this.
All right.
Because there were other options.
All right. So would they have known that Favre wasn't coming back previous to training camp and just accepted that instead of because you also could have gone out and gotten a quarterback from the open market at that point. So
Sure.
Are we talking about knowing? So Favre tells you in June, hey guys, it was fun. We didn't get to Super Bowl, but I beat the Packers twice, and quite frankly, that's all I care about.
I don't even think he tells you in June. I think he just flies. I think for the purposes of this, he tells you in like February. It's just over.
Okay, it's just done.
So
you get another quarterback. 2009 does not resemble, or 2010 does not resemble 2009. Let me be clear there.
Okay.
But Sidney Rice has his surgery. It doesn't become as big a deal. You never get Moss, and because you don't get Moss, Childress doesn't get fired. It's a disappointing year, but it's not altogether a huge shock that it's disappointing. Brad, for sure, is your coach going into 2011. Mm-hmm. You also probably at that point, if you had known in February that Favre was not coming back, my guess is you don't try to run it back as much as you did. And so you actually bring in probably some new pieces and you don't turn over the 2009 roster, but you definitely have some changes there.
A little bit like what the Vikings have done these last couple years after losing.
So I would say this. I would say if Favre does not come back and it's known for 2010, that 2010 is still disappointing, but it's sort of accepted as, hey, 2009 was fun. Brett didn't come back. We're frustrated with Brad, but he's not going to be fired. And conversely, then 2011 is not 3-13. It's probably much more palatable, and you start what would be considered sort of a retool that would get you to crescendo things a bit differently. I'm not trying to say that Brad Childress is still your coach to this day, but I do think that Brad is probably around for at least a few more years, and he's given one more shot probably to try and find a quarterback.
So let me give you a couple different scenarios here because so for sure the Vikings head into the 2010 season, I think, with either Tavares Jackson as the full-time starter. I think that's what Brad would have preferred, right? That, okay, now my guy he has watched Brett Favre, and he's our second-round pick. He's been loyal. Mm-hmm. He's been a consummate professional behind the scenes, and he's been a great backup quarterback. And now this is his actual chance. To maybe 2007 and 8 was just a little bit too early for the guy.
Is Sage still there too?
I think Sage probably, because he got traded anyways.
In training camp of 2010. Yeah. So does he stick around as well?
My guess is Sage probably gets traded still, because him and Chill just kind of bashed heads.
Mm-hmm.
But the other scenario at quarterback could have been Donovan McNabb a year earlier, because Donovan was on the outs in Philadelphia. 2009 was his last year in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
2010 was that bad year with Washington, but Washington was a disaster franchise. The Vikings were a disaster in 2010 because of all the things that happened and Randy Moss and all that stuff. But the Vikings were not a disaster franchise. The Vikings were a great franchise heading into 2010.
Yep.
They just had a bunch of things go wrong because of Favre and Randy Moss and then Brad Childress not getting along with those players, etc. If Donovan McNabb and Brad Childress had the relationship that Brad would like you to think that they had in Philadelphia, my guess is McNabb comes to Minnesota, only 33 years old in 2010, and maybe has a couple years of actual good, meaningful play left. I think by the time McNabb had his experience in Washington, it was Mike Shanahan, right? He had a terrible experience in Washington.
Yep.
And then he gets to Minnesota. I think he was just checked out. But then he gets to Minnesota. He's like, all right, this team sucks. I'm 34. I'd really rather just be like eating Culvers and, like he wasn't in it in 2011. I think if he joins the Vikings a year earlier and they're coming off a trip to the NFC Championship game and it's his system that he's comfortable with in Philadelphia, I think there's a chance I don't think they go back to the Super Bowl or anything, but I think the Vikings are better than 6-10 in 2010 and for sure better than 3-13 in 2012. Better to or good enough to not draft Christian Ponder, but also bad enough to get Brad Childress still fired probably in 2011 or 2012, somewhere in there.
The McNabb scenario is intriguing because of this. I think that Andy Reid and the folks in Philadelphia, when they pulled the trigger on the trade that sent him to Washington, which I believe was during the baseball opener on like a Sunday night and completely stole, of course, all the thunder away from baseball. I think that they had basically figured out that McNabb had checked out entirely by then. And I covered the game in Washington that the Vikings, I want to say, beat Washington with Frazier as coach in 2010.
Yep.
And McNabb just was basically the same quarterback there that he had become here, which is, I don't think he cared.
Yeah.
And I don't know that, in retrospect, I don't know that his relationship with Brad was as it was sold here, as, oh man, he developed McNabb. Well, he didn't call plays for him, and I don't know that he did. But yeah, I do think that the Vikings in no way do things disintegrate to getting the coach fired if Favre does not return, because you don't go out and get Moss. And it was cutting Moss without telling the Wilfs is what got Brad fired. The team stinking was tough, but if he doesn't do that, I think they swallow hard and are like, okay, it's not going well, but the only reason why they panicked and tried to first work the deal for Vincent Jackson, and then subsequently when they couldn't get him, work the deal for Moss, was the fact that Favre had come back. So Brad Childress at the end of 2010 is still your coach.
And I think, one of the dynamics that got Brad Childress fired, and let me back up a step. Brad Childress got better every year record-wise as the Vikings coach until 2010. And I'm not saying he deserves full credit, because obviously bringing Brett Favre in helps. Remember, in 2008, Brad Childress coached a team with T-Jack and Gus Frerotte as the quarterbacks to 10-6, to one of the best run-stopping defenses in NFL history, in a division championship. They go 12-4. 2010, he loses control of the locker room, loses control of communication, narrative. And part of that broken relationship with the locker room is on Brad. Part of it is also on Brett Favre, sort of openly trashing the head coach and undermining him behind the scenes. Like the amount of stories we hear about Brett Favre kind of clowning Chili and, treating him like he doesn't really matter and making fun of him in team meetings and stuff. Like Brett Favre, rightfully so or not, undermined Brad Childress. And so if you were to say goodbye to Brett Favre after 2009 and bring in Donovan McNabb or T-Jack as the starting quarterback, I think Brad, for better or worse, gains more control over the locker room again and is more respected again, maybe like he was a little bit earlier on in his tenure. And that gives him another year or two to ride things out as head coach. I think the Vikings still would have peaked in 2009.
Yep.
But if they go into that 2011 draft and they are better than the 6-10 record that they finished with, now I think if T-Jack is their quarterback in 2010, I actually think they are worse than 6-10. Because Brett, there was a couple games early, like that game against the Cardinals in 2010. Like Brett won them a couple games that they otherwise probably wouldn't have with Tavares Jackson. So if T-Jack is their starting quarterback for all of 2010, do they go 4-12? Do they go 5-11? That brings them into the Jake Locker and Blaine Gabbert discussion for that draft. So if they're still looking for a quarterback, they still get a crappy one.
Yep.
It's just a game of roulette with crappy quarterbacks. But if they were better than 6-10, I think it probably smooths Childress' stay out until like 2011 or 12. And this is the list I want to bring to you guys here. Okay. These are if let's say Brad, 2010 is not a train wreck. In 2011, like let's say it winds down for Brad after a couple more years because it doesn't train wreck as fast as it did in 2010. These are the head coaches that moved into new jobs in 2012 and 13. So right around the time where you would have been looking to make a coaching change if he stays for a couple more years. Okay. Well, Romeo Crennel was the hot candidate coming out of, I can't remember if he had spent some time at Cleveland first, but he definitely was the hot candidate coming out of the Patriots.
Yep.
He spent 1 year in Kansas City and it was a disaster. Mike Mularkey, Jeff Fisher. Stop me if you think any of these guys would have been hired by the Wilfs. Okay.
Okay.
Joe Philbin.
No.
Dennis Allen, Raiders. Chuck Pagano, Colts.
You might got to look.
Intriguing. Definitely intriguing.
Greg Schiano to the Buccaneers.
Yeah, no.
It's a Rutgers guy, New York.
Yeah,
I watch Rutgers.
Yeah, blow hard.
Andy Reid.
The
Vikings miss on their chance to get Andy Reid.
No, because there's no way that you're going to fire Brad Childress
Reid.
and hire the guy who mentored Brad Childress.
That's fair enough.
I do think
Chip Kelly.
I do think what would have gotten Brad ultimately fired is the Ponder draft. Not because he would have taken Ponder, but because any quarterback short of Cam from that draft was going to be Brad's last chance.
But then he would have gotten, if he gets the 2011 draft, he then gets at least through like 2013.
Sure, but he gets jettisoned because, and rightfully so, in the mind of the people that own the Vikings, the Wilfs, they would have said, we hired you because, first and foremost, you were considered to be a quarterback guru, right? And your track record would have been Tavares getting Favre out of mothballs for a year, to your credit, but you still didn't develop him. And then drafting, let's say, if your team was bad enough,
Jake Locker.
He gets you fired. Blaine Gabbert, gets you fired. Christian Ponder, gets you fired. So
is it possible that there was just it's a dead end for almost any coach that drafts those guys, right?
Well, if it's your second chance, right? Now if that draft had been Brad's first chance at a quarterback and he screws it up, he probably gets another chance off of that one. But he's the guy who basically got the Vikings back into the second round in 2006, right? To take Tavares Jackson with the Pittsburgh pick, which was the last pick of that round. And said, this is my guy. So now if you've gone Tavares Jackson, and just for the sake of this conversation, let's say Blaine Gabbert, that's it. See you later. Bye.
When you covered those early Childress Vikings teams for the Star Tribune, what was the chatter around, like, was Brad flat out saying T-Jack is our franchise quarterback? Or was it more like, hey, we really like this guy? What do you remember about?
He didn't say franchise, but it was basically Brad thinking that he had seen enough tools from a quarterback who nobody, for the most part, had seen play in college, that he thought that arm was golden. And he thought that this was going to be Brad personnel-wise, as Sage and our buddy Longwell both said, personnel-wise was really good. But Brad's problem was there were times when he came off as arrogant and certainly overconfident in Brad's own abilities. And when it came to T-Jack, that was the classic case. He was just far too cocky. And it's why when Tavares played that game against the Cardinals team in 2008, I believe, that had just won the division and was completely checked out and didn't care. And Tavares came back to replace Gus, who had got hurt. And Tavares plays this great game that Brad's like, oh yeah, it's clicking now. And we're all like, dude, you got to go back to Gus ASAP.
Yeah.
And Brad was so haughty and so confident that he's like, no. And everyone, I think, tried to tell him, Brad, the Cardinals were drinking beer and smoking weed all week long. You could have torn them up. But instead, Yes. The Cardinals, I think that story is the Cardinals had clinched the division or a playoff spot, I want to say, for the first time since the 70s.
They didn't even study film.
And so they didn't study film. I've heard that they basically spent the week drinking and smoking, which I don't care. That's fine. But Tavares carved him up, and Brad's like, this is for real. And everyone else is like, no, it's not. Go back to Gus. And if you start Gus in the playoff game that they played here at the Metrodome against Philadelphia, I think he got a fighting chance. I really do. That was not a great.
You're higher on Gus Frerotte than I am from that era.
No, I'm just higher.
I love me some Gus Frerotte.
I'm higher on a quarterback who wouldn't have freaked out.
Sure,
Tavares freaked out
for sure. That's fair to say.
I mean, I'm not trying to say that Vikings team gets near the Super Bowl. I am saying that you put Tavares in a situation where he was basically set up to fail.
One last stone that I'd like to turn over here, because we talk about if Brett Favre says early on in the process and it's believable and the Vikings move on from him early in the 2010 calendar year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what would they have done? Because we've talked about the 11 draft and the 12 draft. Like, who could they have? Would they have been better enough to draft like Jake Locker? That wouldn't have mattered because he was garbage too. But what about the 2010 draft? Would they have, instead of going after McNabb, he was available coming from Philadelphia, instead of giving the keys back to Tavares or Sage, would they have said, all right, let's draft a quarterback in 2010? The answer is probably no, because after Sam Bradford, number 1 overall to St. Louis at the time, here were the other quarterbacks that were drafted. Tim Tebow went 25th overall to Denver.
And you remember Brad liked him.
Even there's mocks that saying the Vikings were going to take him.
Brad supposedly, and I've never gotten through.
Wow.
Oh yeah, no, he was.
Yeah, wow.
There was mocks that said
Tim Tebow to the Vikings.
And I never could clear up if this was partial smokescreen or not. But Brad at least supposedly liked him. And there was talk that the Vikings might take him in the first round.
Wow.
I know it's incredible.
So the Vikings almost drafted Tebow. They almost drafted Johnny Manziel. They did draft Ponder.
Yeah, the Tebow one I can't confirm completely. I just know that there was a lot of conjecture about the Vikings were in on the teams that thought that he had a future.
The other quarterbacks were Jimmy Clausen, went late in the second round to Carolina. Colt McCoy, who's still hanging around as a backup, in the third round to Cleveland.
Sure is.
This is a very light quarterback draft. And this was an era where teams were definitely looking for quarterbacks.
Yeah.
Only 4 off the board in the first 3 rounds. Now, how often do you see a draft now where 4 don't come off the board in the first round? And then Mike Kafka, John Skelton, who threw some passes to Larry Fitzgerald a couple times in Arizona. Jonathan Crompton, Rusty Smith.
Great name.
You've lost me on last 2.
Tony Pike. And now we just get into the 7th round, but so there weren't exactly a ton of options.
Tony Pike was a great 6th round pick or whatever.
But so add to the list of alternate reality, Tim Tebow. If the Vikings weren't still kind of like, well, Brett Favre might come back. Tim Tebow.
Which quarterback, if Brad was still here and had control of the 53-man roster, which he did when he was fired, which quarterback do you think he would have overridden Spielman to take in 2011? I don't think it's Ponder.
Probably Jake Locker.
I think Locker's probably the safe bet too.
Jake Locker at one point, a year or two prior, was projected to be like the Andrew Luck of that.
He was,
right?
but there were accuracy problems.
And he got banged up a little bit, but he also just didn't really love playing football, right?
He wasn't good at it.
In fact, I think it was, if I'm correct on this assessment, guys, I believe it was Locker was going to be the next best thing, and then didn't it become Blaine Gabbert?
Yeah.
Blaine Gabbert was at one point in time, I believe, the consensus number 1 pick of that draft until his. But the problem was the league. Here's one of the biggest things, and I think the league has adjusted by actually morphing more towards this game itself. That was in an era where college football had opened things up, right? Completely. And the NFL didn't know how to scout.
Yeah.
Because they weren't doing that yet. Now they sort of do things that actually mirror more and more the college game. But like Blaine Gabbert as a college quarterback, they're all like, oh my God, look at these statistics. Look at what he's doing. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, but does he at all translate to what you guys do on Sundays? Because Saturdays at that time were a different world.
Yeah. So that's a wrap. That's a fun little alternate reality path we just went down there. And there's more too. We'll get
Bud
some more.
Grant never retires as coach.
Wow. He's still the Vikings coach.
Still the Vikings coach to this day.
Still Bud Grant. Just grinding. Still doing the garage sales on Tuesdays.
He wouldn't be grinding tape, so that's not an issue.
That's a wrap on this episode of Purple Daily. I'm Phil Mackey, Judd Zulgad, Declan Goff, and we'll see you next time.